Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are cracking open the case file on the China Eastern Airlines flight MU5735 disaster. Look, when a massive commercial airliner just drops out of the sky in an era of unprecedented aviation safety, our job as investigators isn't just to ask what happened, but how the physics even allow it to happen. So today, we're cutting through the noise. We're going to rely strictly on the telemetry, the hard data, and the evidence to reconstruct the terrifying final moments of this flight. Here is our methodical, step-by-step flight path for today's investigation. We'll look at the anatomy of the crash, analyze the flight data, rule out technical failures, examine the intentional action theory, and finally, answer the big question: is air travel actually safe?
So, Phase 1, Anatomy of the Crash, the final flight.
To really grasp why this event completely shocked aviation experts all over the globe, you have to realize just how entirely perfectly routine it was right up until the very end. On March 21, 2022, at 1:11 p.m., flight MU5735 took off normally from Kunming, China. For a solid hour and 10 minutes, the plane cruised safely and steadily at an altitude of 29,000 feet. It was your standard everyday 2-hour passenger flight. But then, exactly at the 2:20 p.m. mark, the timeline just fractures. The plane suddenly began a rapid, fatal descent that frankly defied standard aviation physics.
30,000 feet. That is the staggering distance this aircraft plummeted in just 1 minute and 35 seconds. Let's put that descent profile into perspective, because that is absolutely not an aircraft experiencing an emergency glide. That speed? That's the terminal velocity of a skydiver in freefall, not a commercial jetliner.
So the crucial question we have to ask ourselves as investigators is this: how does a large passenger jet just fall vertically? Because camera footage captured from a distance confirmed this impossible, horrific reality. The plane was in an absolute vertical nosedive. In less than 2 minutes from the moment things went wrong, the aircraft impacted a forested hillside, utterly destroying the plane and tragically killing everyone on board.
Moving to Phase 2, analyzing the flight data, the telemetry.
Look, modern airplanes are absolute engineering marvels. If an engine quits, or even if there's a catastrophic technical failure, they don't just drop out of the sky like a stone. They are literally engineered to glide. In a standard emergency, you expect a plane to come down at a rate of a few thousand feet per minute, which buys the pilots time to troubleshoot or aim for a forced landing. But MU5735, it descended at well over 10,000 feet per minute. The data here completely contradicts standard aviation emergency physics. Something went rapidly, violently wrong. Now, as we dig into the raw Flight Radar 24 telemetry, there's a bizarre anomaly that deeply complicates our investigation. Right in the middle of its vertical plunge, at around 8,000 feet, the aircraft actually stopped its descent and momentarily regained a little bit of altitude before resuming its fatal dive. This brief ascent is an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle. The physics here show a momentary fight against gravity before that final drop. I mean, was there a physical struggle in the cockpit? Or maybe a desperate attempt to pull up and recover the flight envelope? Okay, standard procedure in any crash investigation, we have to look at the environment. Could severe weather have brought this plane down? Well, we can definitively rule that out. According to the data, the conditions were absolutely normal. 30 degrees Celsius, moderate winds, visibility well over 10 miles. It hadn't even rained before the crash. Now, interestingly, heavy rain did move in later, which severely delayed the search and rescue teams trying to recover the black boxes in that thick forest. But the weather itself played zero role in the crash.
Phase 3, ruling out technical failures, the red herring.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it clears up a massive public misconception. The public easily confuses two very different aircraft. You'll remember the Boeing 737 MAX made huge headlines for those tragic crashes in 2018 and 2019. Those were caused by flawed MCAS software and a lack of pilot training, which actually resulted in a massive $2.5 billion DOJ fine. Because of that history, people immediately blamed the plane model for MU5735. But actually, scratch that, it's a total red herring. The aircraft that crashed in China was not the MAX. It was the Boeing 737-800. That's an older, incredibly reliable, and exceptionally safe model that's been the workhorse of global aviation for years. The whole MCAS software controversy simply doesn't apply here.
So, could it have been some other type of mechanical failure? Aviation expert Neil Hansford points to historical data to say the chances of that are astronomically low. Just look at Air France Flight 447 back in 2009.
That plane suffered severe technical issues and total pilot confusion, but when it fell, it descended slowly in an aerodynamic stall. MU5735 fell like a rock. For an accident to cause a vertical drop at that speed, it would require an unimaginable mechanical failure. We're talking something equivalent to both wings spontaneously snapping off mid-flight or a massive mid-air collision. And since there's zero evidence of that, mechanical failure becomes highly, highly improbable.
Which brings us to Phase 4, the intentional action theory. And yeah, it's a very uncomfortable conclusion.
Just listen to this blunt assessment from U.S. federal aviation investigator Michael Daniel. He states, most likely a foul play. Someone did this intentionally. Multiple experts are pointing to this horrifying conclusion based purely on the process of elimination. Either the pilot or someone who breached the cockpit intentionally pushed the flight controls forward into a failed dive. The aerodynamics required to force a commercial jet into a vertical dive like that literally requires sustained, deliberate, physical pressure on the flight yoke. It doesn't just happen on its own.
Now, while this is exceedingly rare, as investigators we have actually seen this exact data profile before. There are historical precedents for intentional nosedives. Back in 1999, Egypt Air Flight 990 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. And 2 years before that, Silk Air Flight 185 went down near Sumatra. Both of these instances featured airplanes taking steep, deliberate nosedives, and in both cases, the investigations pointed heavily toward intentional actions taken by the pilots. Sadly, the telemetry of MU5735 echoes these exact, dark moments in aviation history.
But why would someone do this? Well, when you have an information vacuum without a clear immediate motive, conspiracies spread like wildfire. Because the public lacks clear answers, wild and totally baseless theories began spreading across Chinese social media. Some were even absurdly claiming the crash was some form of U.S. retaliation linked to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But as focused learners and objective investigators, we have to tune that out. We rely strictly on the data, not internet panic, and we must wait for the actual evidence.
The good news, that definitive evidence we need is locked safely inside the aircraft's recently recovered black boxes. Search teams managed to find one of these crash-survivable memory units. And despite the immense kinetic damage from the sheer violence of that impact, the vital internal memory records are reportedly intact and have been sent to Beijing for decoding. Ultimately, the data locked inside this little box is the only thing that will definitively confirm or deny this foul play theory.
Finally, Phase 5. Zooming out to ask, is air travel safe? The statistical reality.
And this brilliantly illustrates the reality of the situation, just to prevent any unnecessary panic. Look at these numbers. For the Boeing 737, 600, 700, 800, and 900 series, the crash rate is a microscopic 0.07 per million flights. To put that into perspective, for every 1 million takeoffs, it crashes less than 1/10 of a single time. Even for older Airbus models, the numbers hover around 1 or less per million. Statistically speaking, you are looking at one of the safest machines ever engineered by human beings. Crashes caused by weather are practically non-existent today, and your baseline risks are astonishingly negligible.
But honestly, that incredible statistical safety is exactly what makes the tragedy of flight MU5735 so chilling. The plane was totally sound, the weather was perfectly clear, the descent appears deliberate. So, with technical failure all but ruled out and crashes being statistically negligible, we are left waiting for the truth. What terrifying final moments, what desperate struggle, or what silent resolve will that black box ultimately reveal when the final report is declassified? We're just going to have to wait for the